Hey there, it's Mark from MENWHOBULLET, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a different take on a previous video where I did a really cool radial pattern using the Archer and Olive clear stamp collection from their spring collection. What we're going to do today is going to be setting up a celestial pattern, but we're going to be doing it in a square pattern instead of a circular pattern, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. For the materials for this project, the first thing that you're going to need is some type of paper. In this case, I'm going to use cold pressed watercolor paper, just like the way that it looks, but you could use any type of larger sheet of paper to do this. You're also going to need a pencil. We're going to use this to mark out our lines and our grid to stamp on top of. A ruler so that we can make those marks and create those lines. An eraser is going to be a great thing to have, especially at the end, once we're done stamping everything and erasing all of the pencil marks. Because we are stamping, we do need some type of ink to use. You can either use what you have around the house. If you don't have any, I highly recommend VersaFine ink. It's really great for fine details. Since we're using clear acrylic stamps, you're also going to need acrylic blocks. That way the stamps will stick to those and it makes it really nice and easy to stamp. The last thing that you're going to need are the stamps themselves. You can use whatever you have at home to do this. I have quite a collection right now that I'm keeping inside of this photo book. Works out perfectly for these. For today's video, I'm going to be using the celestial stamps from the Archer and Olive Spring collection. You can buy these on their website, archerandolive.com, and you can also use my discount code, MENWHOBULLET10, to get 10% off all of your purchases. When you're building out an art piece like this, it's important to take a look at the stamps that you have available and for the space that you're building it inside of. Some of these longer ones aren't going to work as well as these circular ones, and especially since we're going with this circular theme with the planets and the moon, we're going to go with those, where in some cases some of these patterns might work better in between the spaces versus as the larger piece itself. I love easy math, so we're going to make this nice and easy for what we're going to do. So I'm going to take out a piece of this watercolor paper and I'm going to use my ruler and my pencil to create the space for this. This piece of paper is cut down to be 8 inches by 8 inches for that cool square. And I can turn it on its side to make it into an easy diamond as well. So what we're going to do with our ruler and with our pencil is mark out our paper now with 1-inch squares all the way around an 8 by 8 space. Once I have my top and bottom marks placed in here, I'm going to draw straight lines from the top down to the bottom to create all of my vertical columns. My next step is going to do the same exact thing, but we're going to do those horizontally for the rows, and these will create our 1 by 1 inch squares that we're going to use to stamp everything out on. In my last video, we used the circular compass to create the radial pattern as we went out from the center. And while that's all good and fun, we're not going to need this for this because we're actually going to use all of the cross points on our rows and our columns, and that's where we're going to stamp onto. Our next step is going to be finding the center of all of our squares here. Since we did an 8 by 8, it'll be smack dab in the middle. And then we're going to find our first stamp that we're going to use as a center point for our entire pattern. I'm going to bring in an extra scrap piece of paper to put in underneath of the edge on the left and the bottom of this so I don't get any ink on my surface. And you might want to do the same if you're working right up to the edge. The other option is that you could create an extra inch of space on the top and bottom if you have the space to do so, and that way you can just cut that off later. The first stamp that I'm going to use is going to be this Saturn stamp. I'm going to put that right in the middle of my page where I had that point. And from there, I'm going to build out a pattern vertically. I'm going to skip every other space, and that'll help to create some openness and also not muddy it up too much with that same pattern. When you get to the edges or down to the bottom, you just have to eyeball it just a little bit to see where that square might be for the center. This is supposed to be fun. Don't get on yourself too hard. It'll all look cool at the end if it's not perfect, so no worries, just do the best that you can. Now that I'm done with the stamp, I'm going to clean it off, and I just always like to put my stamps back right away, and that way I don't lose them on my table or they don't fall onto the floor. And we're going to grab one of these moon stamps now and put those in between the planet. In this stamp set, there's 3 or 4 different types of stamps that are here. You have some that are more open, like the Saturn one that we've started to use. I'm going to use this half moon for the next stamp, and the reason is I want to create some visual interest on this page as we're going through. I want to have some dark spaces and some very open white spaces, and I want some that are right in the middle as a transition, and this stamp is going to do that perfectly. We skipped every other space with the Saturn stamp at first, and now what I'm going to do is follow that pattern up and put this half moon in between each of those Saturn marks. Now that I've started vertically, I want to start to work out my pattern horizontally as well now. So I'm going to take that same stamp, and what I'm going to do is something very similar to what we did on the vertical, and I'm going to skip every other space with the half moon to the left and to the right. It's so fun stamping. I just feel like you're working your way out from the center when you're doing the radial patterns. And when you do this crossed pattern like this, it's a little bit different, but you're always starting from the center anyway and just thinking about how this builds up upon what you already have. So this next stamp I'm going to use is going to be the full moon. And as you can see here, it's very dark. As I was just talking about, I want to create some visual interest with this. So using something darker is going to offset the openness that I have inside of some of these others. What I'm going to do here is sit these next to the Saturn stamps, and I'm going to work them out horizontally. In the center part, we have more space horizontally there, so we'll have 4 of those stamps going down every other, and then back to 2 at the bottom. Now that we have all of the moons on here, let's get some more planets on here. I'm trying to think about all of my planets and what they look like or would look like as a line drawing, so let's go ahead and say that it's Neptune. If you think it's something else, comment below, let me know which planet you think that this one is. We're going to build this pattern out horizontally again, starting from the half moon towards the middle. I'm going to use the spaces that we skipped, so every other space in between the half moons, all the way down. Same rule as before, when you're moving over to the edges, you're going to try to find as close to the center of that stamp as you can. It's okay if it's not perfect, so don't get too worried about it. I'm only going to use this every other pattern towards the center of the piece here. I'm going to keep the top and the bottom where I have those other half moons for something else. We have a whole lot of moons, we've got a good amount of planets. Now I want to start to fill out the outside of this and some of the center. Inside of this pack there is a small and a slightly larger star. I'm going to go with the slightly larger star, and this is going to fit perfectly in between each of the moons and planets that we have in the center, and I'll also start to fill out around the outside. You're going to use all of the cross points on these squares as you go through. So the same way that we did for the planets, it's the same thing that we're going to do for some of the smaller details. I'm going to start from the center here and fill in every square, so we're not going to skip spaces like we did before. This will start to visually fill in the middle of this piece and draw your attention in, and then we're going to use some other stamps on the outside to start to draw the eye out a little bit. This piece isn't a complete mirror of itself. While it is mirrored kind of top to bottom, it's not going to be that same circular radial pattern that we have in the last one that I did. So I'm going to keep these spaces open down here to put a different pattern in, and go down another spot here and add the stars. I'm going to skip down a space and add the stars at the bottom, and I'll do the same thing mirroring it on the top. Right next to that little larger star was the smaller star that I mentioned before, and this is the one we're going to use to create some extra patterns around in the open spaces that we had. I'm only going to use this sparingly though, because there's a really cool stamp that we're going to be using up next that is just awesome and needs space to breathe. We're going to skip every other on the top and the bottom where we're going across just to keep it consistent. And don't forget, we're just having fun with this. If you want to go a totally different way, that's going to be up to you. It's so fun to experiment, especially with stamps. The next stamp that we're going to use is a little bit more complex, but I'm really excited about it. It's a constellation stamp here. And I was a little bit nervous about using this because it's not the same small shape. It is a horizontal shape, or if you hold it vertically, it's a vertical shape, but it takes up a lot more space than any of the other stamps that we've used here. It doesn't have an exact center because of the zigzag pattern, but I think it's going to work perfectly right in between these planets and the moons here. We skipped every other space with that smaller star as we went horizontally across this piece, so that's where this constellation is going to go. Make sure you have that scrap piece of paper under the paper you're stamping on to protect your surface, especially when you get to the edges. Let me go ahead and just pull away this scrap piece of paper for a moment so we can see what this looks like in all of its glory. It's looking really awesome. We have just a few small detail spaces left over that we haven't filled in. So inside of the sticker pack, there is another star that's inside of there, but it's an outline star, so it doesn't have the middle filled in. Because of all of the other darker stars that we have, this will counterbalance visually on the page on that outer rim, and still keep that same pattern going, but not make it as harsh. Now that we're done with all of the stamps, we're going to put those all away. We'll put the top back on top of the ink pad so it doesn't dry out. And we're going to finish up the details of this page by cutting out the 8x8 space. I've got my self-healing cutting mat here that I'm going to be using to cut off the edges of this piece. To cut this, a really cool handy tool that I have, it's really super fun, is actually from Slice. If you're not familiar with Slice, they make amazing cutting tools, but they're ceramic blades instead of metal blades, and they're super safe for your hands. They'll cut through the paper, but not through your fingers, which are always very nice. So let's go ahead and use this to cut through the edges of this into an 8x8. Just to mention, if you're interested in picking up any of these slice tools for yourself, you can do so on their website, and you can use my discount code MENWHOBULLET to get percentage off. Now that we have our edges cut off, I've got my 8x8 shape here. I personally wanted this to be a diamond shape, so I'm going to face it that way. Of course, you could also have it square if you needed to. The last thing that we need to do here is take our eraser and get rid of all of the pencil marks. Just make sure that your stamp ink is dry before you start erasing. If you do it right afterwards, you could potentially smear, and we don't want any of that on this beautiful piece that we just spent this time doing. Now that we're all done, we have a beautiful celestial pattern piece that you could frame or put up on your wall, or maybe even include inside of your bullet journal in the future. Just make sure whatever stamp size you're using fits the place that it's going to be going. If you'd like to check out the other radial how-to that I did, I'll link that up above and in the descriptions for you as well. That one is super fun to do as well. And once you learn these two basic ways of creating your own patterns with your different stamps, it makes it so much fun, and you just start to build upon the same idea. And of course, depending on the type of stamps that you're using, the picture looks totally different at the end. Thanks so much again for checking out today's video, and I'll talk to you very soon. See ya.